Train to Nowhere. Chapter 1. The Departure. Natalie Hill stood on the dimly lit platform, gripping the handle of her suitcase so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The train station was eerily quiet for this time of night, with only a few flickering lamps casting long, dancing shadows on the cracked concrete. A chill ran down her spine as she checked the time, 11:55 p.m. It was strange. A station like this, even at night, should have had at least a few more late-night travelers, some stray voices echoing against the cavernous ceiling. But tonight, there was nothing, only silence and the distant hum of something unseen. A single train stood before her, its dark metal frame gleaming under the weak yellow glow. The windows were blackened, reflecting nothing but the empty platform behind her. There was no conductor, no passengers, just an open door inviting her inside, like the mouth of some mechanical beast waiting to swallow her whole. She hesitated, her instincts telling her to turn back. But where else would she go? The train was her only way forward. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to move. With each step, her breath quickened. The moment she crossed the threshold, the doors slid shut behind her with a final sounding hiss, making her jump. The sound echoed through the empty carriage, reinforcing her solitude. The interior was immaculate, almost unsettlingly so. The seats, upholstered in deep blue fabric, appeared untouched, as if no one had ever occupied them. Brass fixtures gleamed under the dim overhead lights, reflecting the eeriness of the situation. Everything was in pristine condition, yet there was no sign of human presence. Not a stray newspaper, not a discarded coffee cup. Nothing. Natalie took a tentative step forward, her suitcase wheels clicking softly against the polished floor. She chose a window seat near the middle of the carriage and set her luggage beside her. Outside, the station was already vanishing into darkness as the train lurched forward with a smooth, almost unnatural glide. The transition was so seamless that she barely felt the movement at all. The platform, the lamps, the distant outlines of buildings, everything faded into a void of blackness, as if swallowed by the night itself. She glanced down the length of the carriage. It stretched into the distance, disappearing into shadow. Was she truly alone? Her stomach twisted uneasily. She was certain she had seen no one else board, but something about the silence felt unnatural, as though someone or something was watching. Trying to shake the feeling, she pulled out her phone. No signal. Of course. She sighed and locked the screen, setting the device on the seat beside her. She told herself she was being ridiculous. It was just a late-night train ride. Nothing more. The train's rhythmic hum became her only companion as she stared out into the void beyond the window. There was no landscape, no passing towns or countryside. Just darkness pressing against the glass. The unease gnawed at her, and she found herself checking the time again. 11:56 p.m. That couldn't be right. She frowned and glanced up at the overhead clock near the carriage entrance. 11:56 p.m. She pulled her phone out again. Same time. No movement. No prediction. It had been at least 5 minutes since she boarded, but time hadn't budged. A shiver ran through her. She turned to the next carriage, hoping to find anyone. Standing, she grabbed her suitcase handle out of habit and moved toward the door at the far end of the car. When she reached it, she hesitated. Through the window, she saw only more empty seats in the next carriage. But something in her gut told her she wasn't alone. Slowly, she reached for the handle and slid the door open. A gust of cold air greeted her, sending goosebumps prickling along her arms. Stepping through, she scanned the rows of seats. Empty, just like the first carriage. Yet she couldn't shake the growing tension tightening in her chest. A sound. A faint rustling, like fabric shifting against leather. She froze, her ears straining. It came from further down, just beyond her sight. The dim lighting cast long shadows that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. "Hello," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. She swallowed hard, taking a hesitant step forward. The rustling came again, closer this time. She stopped, her breath shallow. And then she saw it. A figure sat 3 rows ahead, turned away from her. The person, if it was a person, wore a dark coat, their posture stiff and unnervingly still. Natalie hadn't seen them when she first entered the carriage. Had they been there all along? Had she somehow missed them? She licked her lips, her mouth suddenly dry. "Excuse me." The figure's head snapped to the side, not turning normally, but jerking as if pulled by an invisible string. Natalie's breath hitched in her throat. A deep, guttural whisper echoed through the carriage. Not words, just sound. A low vibration that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She took a step back. The figure didn't move. The train lurched suddenly, the lights flickering overhead. A sound like static filled the air, buzzing in her ears. When she looked back to where the figure had been, the seat was empty. Her pulse pounded. No, that wasn't possible. The overhead clock still read 11:56 p.m. Natalie turned sharply, hurrying back through the door into the first carriage. Her suitcase rattled as she moved, her breathing uneven. She slid the door shut behind her, pressing her back against it as she tried to steady herself. The train rumbled on, its destination unknown. And the clock did not move. Chapter 2: The Silence. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks was the only sound accompanying her. Natalie walked through the carriages, hoping to find another passenger, a conductor, anyone. But each compartment was empty. The silence became suffocating. Checking her phone, she found no signal, no messages. Even the clock on her screen was frozen at 11:55 p.m. She returned to her seat, pressing her forehead against the cold window. The landscape outside was unfamiliar, vast fields stretching endlessly under a starless sky. There were no stations, no cities, no signs of civilization. Just an empty world outside, and an empty train inside. Panic started to creep in. Where was she? And more importantly, where was this train taking her? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Maybe she had fallen asleep and missed her stop. Maybe this was some kind of bizarre dream. But it didn't feel like a dream. The seat beneath her was firm, the air was crisp, and the coldness of the glass against her forehead was real. Too real. Deciding to search again, she pulled herself up and moved toward the next carriage. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing another vacant space. The seats were pristine, as if they had never been used. No discarded tickets, no abandoned bags, just empty rows of seats under the dim glow of the overhead lights. "Hello." Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but in the vast stillness, it seemed deafening. No reply came. She walked further. Another carriage. Then another. The stillness remained unbroken. A shiver ran down her spine. She stopped in the middle of a carriage, gripping a seat for support. Something was very wrong. She thought back to the last thing she remembered, boarding the train at the station, the usual hum of people around her, the announcement over the intercom. She had been on her way home. Then nothing. She didn't recall the train pulling away from the station. It was as if she had skipped a moment in time, leaping from normalcy into this eerie void. A noise. Her breath caught in her throat. A soft, almost imperceptible rustling sound. She spun around, scanning the rows of seats. Nothing. Is someone there? Silence. Natalie's pulse quickened. Maybe it was just the train shifting slightly. Or maybe she wasn't alone after all. She moved forward cautiously, peering into the next carriage. Still empty. The air here felt different, heavier. The light overhead flickered. For a brief second, shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor. Then the light steadied, and everything seemed normal again. Almost. Natalie turned back, intending to return to her seat, but as she reached for the door handle, she hesitated. Something was off. She had come through this door moments ago, but now it looked different. The small sign above the doorway that had read Carriage 4 now displayed Carriage 6. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't passed that many carriages. Had she? Swallowing hard, she pulled the door open and stepped through. Her seat was gone. This wasn't the carriage she had started in. She turned in a slow circle, dread pulling in her stomach. The train looked the same, identical seats, identical lights, but something was fundamentally wrong. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone again. The screen remained frozen at 11:55 p.m. And then, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed her whole. The hum of the train beneath her feet seemed to grow louder, pressing against her ears. She reached out, feeling blindly for a seat, a wall, anything to ground herself. A flicker. The lights sputtered back to life, but dimmer than before. The air felt colder now. Her breath came out in quick, visible puffs. The silence was different, not just empty, but expectant. A whisper. Not her own. Natalie spun around, her heart hammering. The sound had come from behind her, but there was nothing there. The seats remained empty. The carriage was still. She took a shaky step forward, then another. She needed to find an exit. Maybe she could reach the front of the train, find a conductor, if there was one. But as she moved, something changed. The reflections in the windows weren't right. The empty seats reflected back at her, but her own reflection was missing. A wave of nausea hit her. She lifted a trembling hand to the glass. The moment her fingers touched it, a sharp chill shot up her arm, and the reflection shifted. She was there now, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, a dark figure loomed in the reflection, tall and indistinct, its form wavering like smoke. Natalie whirled around. Nothing. Her breath came in short gasps as she turned back to the window. The figure was still there, its head tilting ever so slightly, watching. The train's rhythmic sound grew distorted, the once steady clatter now uneven, stuttering. The air pressed down on her, thick and suffocating. Then, the whisper came again, closer this time. Not yet. The lights cut out again. Chapter 3. The Whispering Shadows. Natalie must have dozed off, because she woke with a start. The lights in the carriage had dimmed to a sickly yellow glow, flickering as if struggling to stay alive. A soft whispering sound echoed through the empty train. She turned her head sharply, nothing. But the feeling of being watched sent shivers down her spine. She sat motionless for a moment, her breath shallow, trying to convince herself that she had imagined it. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks had slowed, the familiar steadiness now an unsettling irregularity. Her pulse quickened as the whispers grew louder, weaving through the air like a ghostly lullaby. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, shifting unnaturally against the walls. Her fingers curled around the seat's armrest as she slowly rose. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The train groaned in response, the metal frame creaking as though it were alive. The air was thick, heavy, as if the train itself was breathing. She swallowed hard and took a step forward. The rows of empty seats stretched endlessly before her. She turned her gaze to the window beside her and felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. Her reflection, her own familiar image, stood still, unmoving, even as she tilted her head slightly. Her eyes locked onto its vacant stare, dark and glassy like bottomless wells. Her breath hitched. That wasn't her. A strangled gasp escaped her lips, and she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. The reflection's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile, though her own face remained frozen in terror. The whispering grew louder, pressing into her ears like voices from another world. Then, all at once, the reflection lunged forward, pressing its hands against the glass from the other side. Natalie screamed. She turned and bolted down the aisle, her footsteps loud against the rickety floor. The train had always seemed narrow, but now the walls felt as if they were closing in. The doors leading to the next carriage rattled violently, as if unseen hands were trying to pry them open from the other side. She hesitated for only a moment before forcing the door open and slipping into the next carriage. The whispers followed. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were voices, distinct but incomprehensible, murmuring words in a language she didn't understand. The lights in this carriage were even dimmer, casting long, unnatural shadows along the seats. Her skin prickled as she walked, cautious and trembling. The carriage was identical to the last, except for one thing. A lone figure sat in the very last seat, its face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. Natalie's breath caught in her throat. She took a step closer. The figure remained motionless, its chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate movements. The whispering grew to an unbearable pitch, and with it, the air around her thickened, pressing against her as though the train itself was alive and watching. She reached out a trembling hand. "Excuse me?" The figure's head snapped up with an unnatural speed. Eyes, wide, hollow, and gleaming, locked onto hers. A grotesque smile spread across its face, stretching wider than humanly possible. The whispering stopped. Silence. Then, in a voice that echoed with something ancient and inhuman, it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Natalie's scream lodged in her throat as the figure lurched forward. She turned and ran, shoving past the seats as the carriage seemed to stretch endlessly before her. No matter how fast she ran, the door to the next carriage remained out of reach. The lights flickered wildly, casting grotesque shapes that moved of their own volition. The reflection in the windows no longer mirrored her. Instead, shadowy figures with hollow eyes pressed against the glass, mouths open in silent screams. A deafening screech tore through the train as the floor beneath her lurched. She crashed into a row of seats, pains shooting up her side. The whispers returned, louder, frantic, crawling into her ears and settling deep into her mind. The train groaned again, and she felt something cold brush against the back of her neck. With a desperate burst of strength, she lunged for the door and wrenched it open. The next carriage was different. The air here was thick with fog, and the seats were covered in dust as if abandoned for decades. A faint, bluish glow pulsed at the far end, barely illuminating the silhouette standing in its center. The whispers ceased. The figure turned. Natalie took a hesitant step forward. The figure was a woman, draped in tattered, flowing garments that seemed to dissolve at the edges like smoke. Her face was pale, her eyes dark voids filled with sorrow. "You have to wake up," the woman whispered, her voice layered with echoes. "Before it takes you." "Wake up," Natalie repeated, her voice barely audible. The train shuddered violently. The air turned ice cold. The woman reached out, her fingers brushing Natalie's forehead. A blinding light engulfed her. And then, Natalie gasped, her eyes snapping open. She was still in her seat, the train moving as if nothing had happened. The lights were normal, the hum of the engine steady. Passengers sat around her, minding their own business. Had it been a dream? Her fingers trembled as she reached for the window. Her reflection stared back at her normal. She let out a breath of relief. And then, just as the train entered a tunnel, her reflection smiled. Chapter 4. The Destination. The train slowed, a deep, mechanical groan reverberating through the empty carriage. Natalie braced herself against the nearest seat, her heart hammering in anticipation. Outside the window, the world was a blur of shadows and fog, barely illuminated by the dull glow of flickering station lamps. The train shuddered one final time before coming to a complete stop. She turned toward the window, squinting to read the station sign that emerged from the mist. Last stop. The letters gleamed as if etched in frost, their stark finality sending a shiver down her spine. Natalie hesitated. If she stepped off now, would she be trapped in this strange world forever? If she stayed aboard, would the train continue moving endlessly, lost in an eternal limbo? A cold wave of uncertainty washed over her, but she knew she had no real choice. The train had reached its end. A hiss of escaping steam announced the door's slow, reluctant opening. Beyond them, the platform stretched out in eerie silence. No conductors, no passengers, just mist curling along the ground, swirling like ghostly tendrils. The air was crisp and biting, each breath forming small clouds of condensation. Natalie stepped forward cautiously. The moment the sole of her boot touched the platform, a shudder ran through the ground beneath her feet. She spun around just in time to see the train dissolve, its carriages unraveling into wisps of vapor, vanishing as if it had never existed. A pit formed in her stomach. There was no way back now. The only path ahead led into the mist. It stretched out before her, winding into obscurity. With no other options, she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and took a step forward. Each step on the cold, damp pavement sent a soft echo into the silence. The fog thickened the further she walked, muffling all sound, swallowing up the remnants of the station behind her. The deeper she ventured, the less certain she became of the world around her. The air carried no scent, no distant hum of life, no indication of where she was going. Then, out of the haze, a flickering light appeared. Natalie quickened her pace. The light swayed, casting long, trembling shadows. As she drew closer, a figure materialized beneath it, an old-fashioned street lamp, casting its glow over a wooden signpost. North, the hollow city; east, the veil of echoes; south, the endless crossing; west, the house of forgotten names. Natalie's fingers brushed over the weathered wood, tracing the carved letters. Each name sent a ripple of unease through her. Where was she supposed to go? Which path was the right one? A whisper stirred in the air, barely audible. Choose wisely. She whirled around, but there was no one there. Just the suffocating fog pressing in closer. Swallowing her fear, she turned back to the signpost and made a decision. North, the hollow city. She stepped onto the path leading north, her boots crunching against loose gravel. The mist thinned slightly as she moved forward, revealing a dim glow on the horizon. As she walked, the silence grew heavier, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Then suddenly, the world shifted. The fog peeled away, revealing towering buildings with arched windows and iron gates. Streets paved with polished stones reflected the pale luminescence of floating lanterns. But the city was empty. No people, no sound. Only the echoes of footsteps that were not her own. Natalie stopped, her pulse racing. Then she heard it. A single, distant chime. She turned a corner and found herself standing before a massive clock tower. The hands on its face moved erratically, spinning forward and backward with no pattern. The chime echoed again, low and haunting. Beneath the clock tower stood a figure cloaked in deep blue robes. The hood obscured their face, but the voice that emerged was calm, expectant. You've arrived, the figure said. Natalie swallowed hard. Where am I? The Hollow City, they answered. A place of forgotten time. She took a shaky step forward. Why am I here? The figure tilted their head slightly. That depends. What do you seek? Natalie hesitated. A way home. The figure raised a gloved hand, pointing toward a massive archway at the far end of the city square. Beyond it, shadows danced, forming shapes that shifted and vanished. The way forward is never simple, the figure said. You must decide. Do you walk through the arch and embrace the unknown? Or do you turn back and let the past claim you? Natalie's breath hitched. She glanced behind her. The way she had come was gone. Only the vast emptiness of the hollow city remained. There was no going back. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the archway, each step echoing into the endless silence. And then she stepped through. The world shattered. Light and darkness wove together, pulling her into a spiraling void. Her body felt weightless, as if she were drifting through an ocean of stars. Shapes flickered at the edges of her vision. Memories, places she had been, people she had known. A voice whispered in her ear, "You are close." Then with a jolt she landed. Natalie opened her eyes to find herself in an entirely new place. A vast field stretched before her, bathed in the eerie glow of twin moons. Strange, twisting trees reached toward the sky, their branches adorned with glimmering, silver leaves. The air hummed with an energy she couldn't explain. Somewhere in the distance, a door stood alone in the field, its frame carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Natalie took a deep breath and stepped forward. The journey was far from over.